If you haven't seen the project video already, the link is in the description.
So you may be wondering, how did a 15-year-old make a web app? Well, I made it like a big boy using pure code and Flask. Flask uses Python, so that's the main programming language you'll see me using today, and you'll get to see my workflow, which includes this. If you haven't done web development or want to get into it, you'll get to see what web development is like. Or if you already know web development, well, we can compare workflows. Tell me how I did. I made this in 2 weeks, so let's begin. But first, I need to explain a few things so you can understand the video. So what's the difference between a web app and a website, you might be asking? Well, a web app is an application that runs on a web server and performs tasks over the internet. Get it? Web app. Well, a website is just static and it never changes. Second, you might be asking, well, what is Flask? Flask is a web micro-framework I can use to make web apps. It being a micro-framework just means its core is simple, which is nice because I can code things myself, but at the same time, I have to code things myself. And finally, I'll explain the webDev concept of routing. So when you're going and searching something in Google, you might notice that there's a slash at the end of a link. This is used to tell the web app which set of code you want to run. For example, if you're going to the login route of my page, you'll see /login. This tells the web app to run the login code and send you back the login page. And that's basically how my web app has multiple web pages. So now that's done with, we can actually begin. Day 1 to 4 was just researching and getting a user account profile working. And that was setting up a database with SQL, getting used to Flask with Visual Studio Code, and just warming myself up. Now you may be asking, how does it take you 4 days to make user accounts? Well, fine. The development process looks something like this. 25% coding.
Alright, it should work, so let me just put this in and then check, and yeah, it works, awesome.
50% wondering why your code doesn't work.
Okay, so why isn't the SQL working? I don't understand.
And 25% Googling why your code doesn't work.
I swear to God, it's 1 a.m. If it's not on Stack Overflow, I'm gonna lose it.
So you can see why it takes. But once I got settled in after 4 days, serious development started. So I sketched a few routes and began making the database. At first I kind of dreaded this part because the whole website revolves around the database. Now, if you didn't know what a database is, it's basically something used to store memory in a computer for a long time in table format, so it's easily accessible. You can imagine it like an Excel spreadsheet, except there are lots of tables and you use fancy syntax to find out what's inside of your Excel spreadsheet. My database's diagram looked like this. So with that in mind, I made the database, set up an SQL connection library, and began putting the queries into different groups. The database is queried whenever the user views something, submits a change, or creates something. At first I was using SQL Alchemy for the databases, but that's kind of a cheat and I realized it was trash because I prefer being a pro and just querying the database myself because it's more personalized. So I just deleted that, and beautiful. Anyways, more development happened, and about 2 days later, it was day 7, and I had a basic prototype working. Now, it wasn't anything too fancy, I just used tables to represent the information. But this simply wouldn't do because this isn't really a proper website, and I like to do things properly, so I wasn't going to submit it like this. To make it be a proper website, I needed to add some JavaScript for that spice. If you don't know what JavaScript is, it's the code that runs on your computer when you see a web page. And in the context of my website, it's using the input field pop-ups and the moving and saving notices. Now, the moving and saving notices part, that's what's really exciting.
So for this segment, we're gonna go into Visual Studio Code so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about. So first off, let's talk about positioning the notices. I used CSS attributes to position them, specifically the top and bottom ones because they work just like XY coordinates, which was really helpful. They even have an added bonus of using percentages, so it's cross-platform compatible. With all this, all the web app has to do is retrieve a notices position from the database and use Jinja to insert it into the notices div. Secondly, we need to move the notices. For this part, I use the JavaScript touch events, which are neat because they work for tablet and PC. So first off, each notice is a div and has a unique ID. When a notice is touched, it calls a function, its div calls a function, and it passes its ID as an argument. This function then saves this information in a global variable called notice being dragged. Then there's always an onPointer move event which checks for movement. If there's a notice that is saved as a notice being dragged, it moves this notice with the pointer. And then finally, if you stop holding down, the pointer's up, the variable notice being dragged is set to null, so nothing moves. Sadly, this segment has ran out of time, but if you want a whole video on the fine details, just leave a comment.
But before I could get to the really fun part in finishing off my website, I had to human code. Now, you know, humans are very malicious. They'll try to break in, they'll try to hack your code. And I couldn't have that, so I had to invest some time into it. And I took a few precautionary measures. First, don't even try editing the HTML subediting form. The web app checks for if you actually own something when you're going to change the database. Second, don't go try editing the roots because it will check if you own the board. Third, in case of any breaches, all passwords are encrypted, but I can't share more information. Just know it's safe with me. Finally, I implemented a password policy with a fine print, just in case anyone else still, despite this, goes and puts their username and password as password, and they'll just get hacked really easily. After that, it was day 8 now, and it's time for the really fun part, and that's styling the webpage. So I must warn you, I'm not an artist, so I had to reference and start researching for this before I could even start. Once I started, I had to style it with something called CSS. Now, I already made the web pages with HTML, but to style it, I need to use something called a style sheet, and that's a CSS file. After about a full day's work, I got something like this. And I thought it was pretty snazzy until I realized not everyone uses my computer screen.
You just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
So I had to style for different screen sizes. I considered a few possibilities, but in the end I just made 4 different style sheets, one for phone, tablet, PC, and extra large PC. And yes, I have an extra large PC style sheet because for some reason, people have a 1920 by 180 monitor, so I had to get it ready for that, and it was pain. In the end, I got my website looking pretty nice on most devices. And yeah, after 12 days work, I finally got my CS50 project done, and I was pretty proud of it. So that was a devlog. I didn't go too in-depth to discombobulate you guys, but that was a general workflow. In webDev, you use lots of languages and put them together. I used about 5. JavaScript, HTML, CSS, Python, and SQL, and you put them to make something better. Python's used for the backend, JavaScript's used for interactive websites, and SQL's used for the databases. So if you enjoyed it, click that like button because I would appreciate it. I finished?